I begin, Dick, by saying welcome home, because in a sense, this is where it all began. Dick's first assignment upon completing his doctorate at Rome's Gregorian University, when he returned and had been in Rome during the last two sessions of Vatican II. And when he returned to the United States, he was appointed to the faculty of Pope John the 23rd Seminary in Weston, 1965. And even I can recognize that this is his 40th anniversary year of teaching at theology at a graduate level, and it's so fitting that he would come back here to the old neighborhood to celebrate it. So he was at Pope John the 23rd from 1965 until 1970. In my opinion, in the United States Catholic community, over these past 40 years, no theologian has contributed more to the well-being of the church in the world and to seeing to it that it becomes an effective sacrament of God's reign. Nobody has been more significant in that good enterprise than Dick McBrien. Never afraid to take on a controversial issue, he's been a voice of extraordinary insight, of measured wisdom, of courage and creativity, and yet one of intense faithfulness to his beloved Catholic tradition and to his own integrity. Dick has many distinctions. Indeed, as you might well expect, served at a very young age, probably one of the youngest presidents ever of the Catholic Theological Society of America, 1973 to 74. 1976, he was the recipient of the John Courtney Murray Award, which indeed is the highest award that Catholic theologians of the United States can confer upon one of their own. A priest of the Archdiocese of Hartford. Since 1980, Dick McBrien has held the Crowley O'Brien Endowed Chair of Theology at a small university in South Bend, Indiana, and indeed served there for 11 years as chairperson of Notre Dame's Department of Theology from 1980 to 1991. You notice I've left out from 70 to 80. What happened in that good decade? Of course, these were Dick's most productive and auspicious years because they were indeed spent here at Boston College as one of our senior professors of theology. I referred to his great wisdom, and indeed among his friends he is highly esteemed for his sage counsel. However, there might be two good reasons to question his sound judgment. One would be the fact that he left Boston College and moved to Notre Dame. I mean, for a bright, intelligent man, go figure. But giving our ecumenical sensitivities, we have, of course, long since forgiven him for that lapse of judgment. The second reason for questioning his good judgment might be and this is more serious by far, and whether he admits it or not, he was actually the person who hired me here at Boston College. 1976, Dick was then the director of our institute. I had just made my first Holy Communion at the time, and a little baby professor. He took me in, and here I am still. Dick came here from Pope John the 23rd in 1970 and tells the story that one summer he was returning from a summer workshop with Jack McCall, and he was beside him in the airplane. They were returning from St. Thomas University in Houston, Texas, and one of them said to the other, "Why are we going to Texas to do this? Why don't we do it at BC?" And sure enough, the following summer, the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry was founded, began in 1971, and Dick actually taught the first class taught in our institute. That first summer, it was Dick McBrien, Dick McCormick, and Jack McCall. And as you might expect, they became known as the Mighty Macs, and has gone on from there. In 1975, Dick became the director of the institute. As a scholar, he's been extraordinarily prolific, the author of some 20 books. And when I say Dick has written 20 books, I mean real books. I mean, for example, this Catholicism is, it's only 1,279 pages. The Encyclopedia of Catholicism, by contrast, is 1,438 pages. And then some of his shorter works. like the lives of the saints, the lives of the popes. The lives of the saints, by the way, is on sale outside from our bookstore with a $3 reduction. So it's a bargain at any time, or any price, but certainly the $3 reduction is it's a steal. So Dick has written these extraordinary books and been a tremendous contributor to the theological world, but one of the things that I think he deserves most credit for is that, unlike many of our theological colleagues who avoid the controversial issues of our time, and in fact many of us prefer to talk to each other only, Dick has been writing a popular column for over 40 years, a weekly column in Catholic newspapers that has won many awards and has been an extraordinary source of adult education to the U.S. Catholic community for these 40 years. Speaking on a purely personal perspective, in my own life I've been blessed with a handful of true friends, and indeed one of them is Dick McBrien, and I've never had a more loyal one than Dick. Would you give him a warm welcome, please?
Well, thank you all for coming, and one sits there when one is introduced by Tom Groom and just wonders what he's going to say, but his remarks were all too generous. Now is the time for the corrections. My column has actually not quite so long as 40 years. It's started in July of 1966, so I'm in my 39th year, or about to begin it. I can recall, since many of you have Boston roots, and those who don't are here at Boston College or in the area, I recall when my column was I started my column back in my home archdiocese of Hartford in the Catholic Transcript. And Monsignor Frank Lally was the editor of the Boston Pilot at the time, and when he saw it being published down in Hartford, he called and asked if I would also let it be published in the Boston Pilot, and of course I was happy to do that. And Cardinal Cushing, whose memory I honor with the greatest respect, they don't make them like that anymore. Cardinal Cushing said, "Dick, the one piece of advice I'd give you is don't write about money." In other words, that was his specialty. And he didn't care what else I wrote about theology or doctrine. In fact, a book that Tom didn't mention, not that I wanted him to, I did a book way back in 1969 called "Do We Need the Church?" And Cardinal Cushing, I went in to give him a copy because Cardinal Cushing was a very, very supportive friend of mine. And I'm not just dropping a name. I have great affection for him as I think back. And he said, "Well, I'd like to support you. How about if I bought some books? I mean, are you going to be able to sell enough?" I said, I've got a commercial publisher. It was Harper and Row in those days. But I said, "Your Eminence, don't do that now because I want you to see it first. It could be controversial." And "Oh, no," he said. And I said, "You're mentioned in the book." So he looked and he said, I'll always be a footnote in theology," because he was the one who submitted an appeal to Rome when Father Leonard Feeney and his followers were giving so much trouble to him, picketing outside of his residence on Commonwealth Avenue. And so he appealed to Rome, "You got to help me out." And Rome did. They issued a document in which they said, "Well, what Feeney is saying is right, but you got to understand it the way the church understands it." And they made a distinction between being a member of the church in re and being a member of the church by desire, and so forth and so on. So he was always proud of the fact that he was going to be a footnote in theology. And then he said, "Well, I want to get 100 copies." I said, "No, read it first." He ended up ordering 500 copies. And then he gave a copy to the then apostolic delegate, and he said, "I've already seen it." Anyway, it is a special pleasure for me to return here to Boston College. I have great affection for Boston College, and I'm not just saying that because it's expected to say that. I still have many friends here, and I have many, many fond memories of of Boston College from way back. I taught here actually part-time. When I came back from Rome, I was teaching at Pope John Seminary in Weston, and Tom O'Malley, Father Tom O'Malley, was chairman of theology in those days, and Bill Leonard, I'm sorry, Tom succeeded Bill Leonard, and he invited me in to teach part-time. So I taught part-time in late 60s. In fact, one of the faculty in theology who has a chair, John Paris, was one of my students in those days. Then I became full-time in 1970, and I was here full-time until 1980, when I was recruited in the tradition of Frank Leahy to go to that unnamed university in the Midwest. Tom and I have this thing that we don't mention the name. It's like Yahweh. You just don't. In any case, I'm happy to be here, and I'm proud of the association I had with the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry. Then Jesuit Father Jack McCall, who's now very much alive, and we stay in touch. He lives in North Carolina. He and I hatched the idea of this institute on the plane coming back from Houston that summer. And the very next summer, the institute, we began, and I think the first course was in this, I think it was in this auditorium. Yeah, and so, were you here?
Yeah, we were.
Oh, this is extraordinary. Well, that's wonderful to see you here. Anyway, we started off here, and it's grown to be a great enterprise, and I'm proud of those who carried on long after I've left, and salute them for the great achievements that they have made and for the great future that lies ahead because of those achievements. My lecture this evening is entitled "The Church and Human Sexuality, an Ecclesiological Perspective." I did not have any drinks. I only drank water and Coke. But the subtitle I insisted on because I don't pretend to be a moral theologian and Christian ethicist of the quality, let's say, of my friend and former colleague Lisa Saul Cahill or others in the department. So I made sure that I had a subtitle, "An Ecclesiological Perspective." I'm here not as an ethicist, not as someone who is an expert from a theological point of view of questions pertaining to sexuality and reproduction, but as an ecclesiologist who's trying to situate the discussions on these highly controverted issues from the vantage point of our understanding of the nature and mission, ministries, and structural operations of the church. As promised in the Institute's Continuing Education Catalog, the presentation will review the sexual abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church and its priesthood within the broader context of the Church's teachings and practices regarding human sexuality. The lecture will underscore the damage done to the Church's sacramental life, which is its greatest spiritual asset, and suggest ways in which the Church can promote healing, renewal, and reform. Now, I accepted this invitation well over a year ago. It's not that I regret it, but it was a long time ago when this series was planned. And I had, I think you can imagine, I had a few other lecture invitations in the meantime to fulfill. And I assumed, as I looked at my calendar, that I would have a good part of the month of April, this month, to prepare this lecture. Well, as you know, Pope John Paul II entered the final stage of his earthly life on April 1st, and I was immediately summoned from a lecture I was giving in Connecticut to do my first live interview in my brother's living room in West Hartford. They sent a satellite truck, and the neighbors were quite interested in what was going on. And then I immediately went back to South Bend and did the coverage from there. And he passed into eternity the following day, and we covered it there. And then, of course, we were in that interim period, and then the entrance into the conclave, and then the time just before and after the announcement of the new pope. So I found that the 4 weeks that I had expected to have at my disposal for this presentation this evening dwindled to less than 1 week. Doesn't mean I'm going to say now that I've come unprepared this evening and I'm going to wing it. I'm prepared and I'm not going to wing it. But fortunately, the topic The reason is the topic is one that I have thought about and written about and spoken about before. In fact, I have written and spoken about the sexual abuse crisis so much in the past, especially in the year 2002, when it first burst upon the scene here in Boston with extraordinary intensity and ferocity, that my main concern this evening is that I might not have something fresh to say about it. But that is why I particularly look forward to the question and answer period following the presentation. Members of the audience might be able to draw out from me comments on one or another aspect of the crisis that I've simply not referred to, either through neglect or either I didn't have time to do it. So if you please feel free once I've finished, that if you have questions that have to do with this whole issue, want to see, for example, what the election of Joseph Ratzinger, what impact that might have on this crisis, feel free to ask. What is morally certain, however, is that neither the lecture nor the Q&A will exhaust the subject. If you are stimulated to continue thinking about the topic and talking about it and trying to find ways of actually doing something constructive about it, then my appearance here this evening will have fulfilled a positive purpose. The Roman Catholic Church still finds itself today in the midst of a crisis, perhaps the most serious crisis it has faced since the time of the Reformation, and in my judgment, the most serious crisis in U.S. Catholic history. And the reason I say that, the reason I think the crisis is so grave, is that it points and has pointed a virtual dagger at the heart of the Catholic priesthood itself. Notwithstanding the central role and irreplaceable role of the laity in every aspect of the Church's mission and ministries, the ordained priesthood is essential to the Church's sacramental life. With the Eucharist at its center, the Church's sacramental life, as I said a moment ago, is its greatest spiritual asset. I tell my students at that institution in the Midwest that in spite of the complaints that people sometimes make about the Church in various aspects, the reason why people become or remain in the Catholic Church, and by saying that, I mean church in the most ecumenical sense, but my point of reference obviously there this evening is the Catholic Church, but these references are broader than that. The reason we stay in the Church is because of its sacramental life. And, you know, governments come and go, but the country, if you are an American citizen, the country is still our country. You know, all kinds of people, maybe some of you here said it, but don't, I got a light blinding in my eyes anyway, so I really can't see too many faces. I can see more than you think. But I'm sure there are at least a few on the BC campus that said, if George Bush is reelected, I'm going to Canada. Nothing wrong with Canada. Well, how many people do you see seeking passports to go to, you know, citizenship in Canada? It's the temptation that people have. You know, if this happens, I'm not going to stay. And the reason people stay, whatever their politics, is because this is their country, this is their home. And the reason people stay in the Church, if they've got a bishop they're not happy with, they have a new pope they're not happy with, whatever might be the case, or pastor, because they can always move to another parish. It's not so easy diocese to diocese, but nonetheless, it's because they remain in the Church because it's still their home. And it's their home because it's the place where they go to have dinner, their family dinner, which is the Eucharist. And it's the place where their children are initiated into life in the baptism and are initiated into the beginnings of adulthood, maturity, in confirmation. It's the place where their loved ones receive the final corporate communal attention in the sacraments of the anointing of the sick and all the rituals that come before it and during it and after it, and the funeral mass and the burial and so forth. And it's the place where our sons and daughters solemnize and ritualize and celebrate their hope and commitment to live together and to raise their own families. And you can go right down the sacramental life of the Church. It ritualizes and celebrates and gives thanks for all the most important moments and experiences in human life. Why turn your back on that? Just because someone else happens to be in the Vatican, or someone else happens to be in the Archbishop's residence or Bishop's residence, or someone else happens to be in the rectory as pastor. I mean, it makes life more difficult, no doubt about it. We end up having to spend a lot of time, wasted time and energy, trying to get around people who should be facilitating our life as Catholics, as members of the church, not making it more difficult, not throwing up roadblocks and barriers and impediments. But that's the reality. And so we work through that reality. It's not always easy for a lot of people. One of the most common, and I'm not boasting about this, I'm simply reporting. I'm getting to the point where I'm old enough to be able to speak frankly without fearing that it's going to sound boastful. But I get the two most frequent compliments I get, and by the way, you ought to see my email, I get a lot of non-compliments too. But the two most frequent compliments I've received over the years as a lecturer and as a teacher is the clarity, which indicates that a lot of lecturers, you don't know what they're talking about, but the clarity. But the thing that impresses me most is you give me hope. Now, I must admit, sometimes I worry about that. Sometimes I worry if I'm giving too much hope, if I'm making life more difficult for people, but I can't change. And because optimism, as you know, is not hope. Hope is a theological virtue. And we must all have hope that the church is not simply a human institution, although it's very human, but that it is an institution that is co-created by Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, and that has a place in our lives and in our history which transcends any bureaucracy or any authority figure at all. Indeed, most people, as I said, become and remain members of the church because of its sacramental life. Without that sacramental life, the church is not and cannot be the church in the fullest sense of the word. The word crisis is derived from the Greek verb krinein, which means to separate or to decide. A crisis is literally a turning point, a moment or a stage at which a process of whatever kind can go in two or more directions. It is a time of deciding. To be in crisis is to be at the threshold of decisive change, usually attended by risk and some measure of suspense. One of the advantages of teaching in a university, as my former colleagues here will testify as well, you have colleagues in all different fields. And I'm one of the few theologians at Notre Dame who remained in my office space in the building called DCO Hall. We have our own theology building, which I brought about before I left the chairmanship there. But on my corridor of the new DCO Hall, all the theologians left and the philosophers, they're in the new building. And I have a number of colleagues on my corridor who teach in different language departments. And I have a number of Asians, Chinese especially, but Japanese as well in their background. And so I checked this out. The Chinese characters, there's two characters. I asked my friend from Nanjing, I said, now Leon, write out the Chinese character for crisis. I thought he was going to write one character. He wrote two. And I said, well, what does it mean literally? And he said, it means opportunity. The word Chinese character for crisis is opportunity, but it is one marked by danger. In other words, a crisis presents itself as an opportunity to move in a new and different direction, although not without risk. Such an opportunity holds the promise and the hope of ever greater possibilities, among which is that of becoming church in a new and more spiritually fruitful way. At the outset here, I want to make a point of referring to the Roman Catholic Church rather than to the Catholic Church in general, or more precisely, the Catholic communion of churches, Roman and non-Roman alike. Significantly, the sexual abuse crisis seems not to have touched the various non-Roman but authentically Catholic churches which happen to have a married priesthood. And that is not an insignificant point, as I shall refer to in due course. What can be said about the causes of the sexual abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church? I would identify three theories or explanations. First, that the crisis is the result of a lack of fidelity to the church's official teachings on human sexuality, particularly those concerning homosexuality. Second, that it is a serious but isolated problem caused by a few bad apples in the priesthood. And third, that the crisis is symptomatic of much deeper systemic and institutional problems in the church. The first theory, that the crisis was caused by a lack of fidelity to church teachings, identifies the solution as one of greater fidelity to church teachings on human sexuality through tougher enforcement, especially in seminaries that are said to be dominated by gays in both the student body and faculty. Some proponents of this first theory, like the late Pope's official spokesman, Dr. Joaquin Navarro-Valls, went so far as to say that gays cannot even validly be ordained. Others, like the former Cardinal Archbishop of Philadelphia, Anthony Bevilacqua, decreed that no gays could be admitted to his seminaries nor ordained to the priesthood for the archdiocese. I'm not a cynical person, but I'd like to say something off the text. I often asked, even on television, will that rule be retroactive? And will it apply to bishops, of which there are many who are gay? That is not to say something bad about them. It's to say something true about them. Still others, and there's nothing worse than a gay who bashes other gays. Still others called for the replacement of suspect seminary faculty members by reliably orthodox teachers. Medical professionals, however, would not agree that pedophilia, which is the sexual abuse of prepubescent children, and ephebophilia, which is the sexual abuse of post-pubescent minors, medical professionals say they would not be prevented, these abuses, if only potential perpetrators remained faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church. That would be like saying that murders and other forms of violence would be prevented if only the perpetrators had obeyed the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. The problem goes much deeper than a failure to obey moral teachings. We are dealing here with compulsive and addictive behavior, particularly in the case of pedophilia, where the possibility of rehabilitation, according to some medical professionals, is said to be next to zero. And more profoundly still, we're dealing with the mystery of evil itself. If active dissent against the teachings of the Church were the real underlying cause of such depravity, as some well-known people on the right in the Catholic Church have said publicly, why is it that so-called Orthodox priests and even bishops have also engaged in sexual abuse? And if this behavior is also necessarily linked with homosexuality, as many conservative Catholics have charged, what evidence is there that liberal clergy and seminarians are more likely to be gay than conservative clergy and seminarians? Indeed, if we are to accept the testimony of those with long-standing experience in seminary work, someone, for example, of the stature of Father Donald Cozzens, author of The Changing Face of the Priesthood, and Sacred Silence, and other books, there are at least as many conservative gays in seminaries and the priesthood as there are liberal or progressive gays. Orthodoxy has nothing to do with it. In mentioning Donald Cozzens' name here, by the way, I should also like to call your attention to an exceedingly important two-page article he has just published in Commonweal magazine, the April 22nd issue, entitled Sex and the Seminaries, What Really Ails Them. And I'm going to return to that article and quote from it later on. The solution offered by advocates, however, of the second theory, that the crisis was created by a few bad apples in the priesthood, is essentially the same as the remedy offered 3 years ago by the bishops in Dallas. The bishops said that the crisis can be resolved if they were to take complaints about sexual misconduct in the priesthood more seriously in the future, reach out to victims and survivors in a more pastorally compassionate fashion, abandon secret legal settlements, cooperate with the civil authorities, remove accused priests from their pastoral assignments until allegations have been thoroughly and independently investigated, expel known abusers from the priesthood itself, the so-called zero tolerance policy, and tighten seminary admissions procedures to keep potential abusers out of seminaries and therefore out of the priesthood as well. And then they announced to the country through the voice of Bishop Wilton Gregory, who has since been promoted to Archbishop of Atlanta, but he was at the time president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He announced, "The crisis is now history. It is behind us. It is over." To be sure, each of the initiatives endorsed by the bishops in Dallas 3 years ago was urgently needed, with some qualifications regarding the so-called zero tolerance policy that has been subjected to strong criticism from canon lawyers, associations of priests, leaders of religious communities, and the Vatican itself. But these solutions, based implicitly on the few bad apples hypothesis, did not address the deeper and longer-term aspects of the crisis. The problem was not with a few bad apples. The problem was with the barrel itself and those who construct it, fill it, and maintain it. The solution offered by proponents of a third approach, namely that the roots of the crisis are systemic and institutional, requires not only closer scrutiny and supervision of seminarians and priests, which is always a good thing, but also a reconsideration of the Roman Catholic Church's discipline of obligatory celibacy, the exclusion of women from the priesthood, and the process by which bishops are appointed and the manner in which they exercise authority. You would notice this because I have the advantage of the text. But I didn't say these have to go, although I may have my opinion about that. I say simply a reconsideration of these issues. In other words, they've got to be put back on the table for discussion. Namely, 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, the National Board of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious made this statement: "We're convinced that the current crisis calls for systemic change, particularly in the exercise of ecclesial power. We call for the inclusion of laity, Catholic clergy, brothers and sisters, in the formation of policies and in decision-making which will allow for collaborative renewal of our church." And the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Thomas F. Riley, offered a somewhat gamier analysis in an interview the same year with the New York Times. The hierarchy, he said, has to change their ways. They need to be more open. They need to be less secretive. They need to be more responsive, and they need to listen. Until that happens, all of us need to be more vigilant. The Roman Catholic Church's celibacy requirement, however, is a particularly decisive factor underlying this crisis. Because of its canonical requirement of obligatory celibacy for priests, the Roman Catholic Church must draw from the thinnest slice of its own population for its most important ministry. Namely, it must draw from a thinnest slice of its population, which is constituted by unmarried males who believe themselves to possess the capacity or charism to observe lifelong celibacy in every sense of the word. In its commendable efforts to increase the number of vocations to the ordained priesthood, therefore, the Roman Catholic Church, in effect, ties both of its hands behind its back and wears a blindfold besides. Just off the text, can you imagine any comparable profession? And I don't mean it's not a vocation. I don't mean it's not sacred. Please don't read into what I'm saying. But can you imagine a comparable profession, legal profession, medical profession, U.S. Congress, academic, that would require that, well, we're going to recruit the best people we can. Now, they all have to be male. And they all have to be unmarried. If they were married, their wives have to be deceased, or they got a Catholic divorce, which is called an annulment. And then, whatever the case, they must be willing to promise lifelong celibacy for the rest of their life as a condition of continued employment. That's not a very big pool. And again, don't read into this. I am not homophobic. I have defended gays in the priesthood. If they have a pastoral aptitude and vocation, fine. I mean, there are a lot of heterosexuals who should not be in the priesthood. It's not a point. But when you draw from that thin slice of the population of the church, it's inevitable you're going to draw, and it's becoming more of the case today, a disproportionately large number of gays and a disproportionately large number of sexually dysfunctional and radically sexually immature men of whatever age, young and the so-called delayed vocations. You're asking for trouble. And especially if you have the added pressure of a bishop on his vocation director's back, saying, I need more, we need more vocations. And, I was on a seminary faculty, as Tom Groom introduced me. I was on a seminary faculty at Pope John Seminary, and we used to always have these very spirited discussions out there. And we used to say, we could fill this place up, build a wing, and then build a branch. God knows where in Massachusetts, if we took everybody who wanted to be a priest. And these were so-called delayed vocations. And maybe we were cynical, but many of us said at that time, unfortunately, there are too many Catholic men, some already middle-aged, older, and some younger, who think because they have not yet succeeded in anything in life, that they must be called to the priesthood. It sounds cynical. And that is not true of so many of the men who went through Pope John Seminary. On the contrary, some fine candidates. But I say, if there were no standards at all of admission, there are all kinds of people who would like to be a priest, because in those days now, this is pre-crisis, the priesthood gave people instant status. And you also never had to worry, you get fired from one job, you land on your feet somewhere else. They got to take you in. They got to give you meals and a shelter and a salary. The worst of us, never were thrown out into the cold. So we said you have to be very careful. It's not just who wants to be a priest. At one time in my life, I wish I had been a United States senator. You don't just apply. You have to work pretty hard to get elected. You don't just say, well, I'd like to be this, I'd like to be that. Sure. But the question is whether you have what it takes to fulfill that kind of responsibility, and whether you'll find enough people who agree with your own self-estimation. The downward spiral of vocations in the priesthood over the past few decades has occurred in spite of assurances from some U.S. church officials back in the 1970s and 1980s that the situation, like the stock market, was about to bottom out, and that vocations would soon return to their robust 1950s levels. That has not happened. It did not happen. There are various reasons why a vocations rebound has not occurred. Among them are society's greater openness regarding human sexuality, the rise in the economic status and educational opportunities of many Catholic families. Many young men back in the 1940s and 50s had very few options, even bright young men. Today they can go anywhere. I mean, there are some of my former fellow seminarians at St. John's across the street who are here, can verify what I'm saying. I mean, we used to refer, not me, I didn't know enough about it anyway, but that place across the river was the Harvard. You're referring to one of the greatest universities in the world. That place across the river, see. So people, we think of it now, young Catholic males and women, any number, a broad spectrum of universities, distinguished, prestigious universities. They get scholarships and so forth to go to these places. The range of options was very limited, very limited. So that's a big difference. So many Catholics are on the upper ends of the economic and educational strata. Also, a concomitant broadening, as I said, of career choices for potential priests. And then the loss of the traditional cultural supports for the celibate life. When thousands of priests resigned from the active canonical priesthood to marry, especially in the late 1960s through the 1970s, thousands more young men who might have considered studying for the priesthood, began to think twice about the viability of a lifelong commitment to celibacy. You can't appreciate the significance of that change. Again, I won't embarrass them by calling on them to get up and say yes. It's not been, maybe they'll get up and say no. But I remember, maybe I did less inventive things on our 1-hour so-called violent recreation break in the middle of the afternoon at St. John's. And if it was raining, you had to stay inside. And I mean, you say, boy, well, you guys must have been desperate for amusement. One of the things we would do is walk up and down the corridors and look at these class photos and see if we could spot some of our teachers and how funny they must have looked in their high collars and, you know, their different haircuts. And so we all look funny when you can look back 45 or 50 years. What the heck? But in those days, I remember someone would whisper, they say, you see, class of 43, third one down, third column, he's left. There was a book written, Shepherds in the Mist. Say, he's left, he's married, or he became a congregational minister. Okay. Then you go down a few classes and say, class of 47, say eighth row, fifth one down, he's left. Maybe you get up a little further and they start saying, well, this 2 rows, you see. Now they could go in and say, you see this class, row 2, row 8, row 6, and the rector, they've gone. That makes a very profound impact, because a seminarian living in a very hothouse environment, a very, very enclosed residential kind of experience, what you have is the example of the priests who teach you, but also the priests you know in parishes. And it was a rare event for a priest to, quote, leave the priesthood to marry or whatever. It became, in the 60s and into the 70s and after that, became a common occurrence. Nothing disgraceful about it, just a common occurrence. People realized, as there was greater opportunities for making relationships, there's nothing evil about that. I mean, we're talking about people falling in love. Not people, you know, furtively engaged in some perverse activity. That perverse activity, we say under other circumstances, is a participation in God's sacramental activity. How can we forget all the wonderful things we say about marriage when it's applied over here? So we're talking about people who came to realize they did not have the charism of lifelong celibacy. And nuns were no longer in their diver suits. Priests were not wearing the shield of the clerical uniform and so forth. And what happens is it happens in any professional setting. People collaborate with one another and come to know one another as persons. And a relationship develops. There's nothing evil about that. It's a reality. And that's the changed reality. That's why it's not that young people no longer are willing to make a sacrifice. It's that young people who are healthy, and they could be homosexual and healthy. I'm not saying that you have to be heterosexual, but healthy people say, you know, this sort of life is not something I can commit myself to for my entire life as a condition for continued service. Add to this the fact that the ministry of a parish priest is actually more difficult now than it was in the so-called golden 1950s. The priest often lives alone, and this would be true especially in a large urban archdiocese like Boston. The priest often lives alone in an oversized rectory, a relic of a bygone era. This is especially true in the cities and not so much in the suburbs, without the support and companionship of other priests. In many dioceses, he's responsible for more than one parish, sometimes having to drive 50 to 100 miles on a weekend for Mass at two or more locations. And there is far more to his pastoral responsibilities than presiding at the Eucharist and administering the other sacraments. Burnout too often follows. When bishops are asked, not only by the media, but also by their own priests, whether they are at least open to a discussion of issues like obligatory celibacy and the ordination of women, The bishops have almost uniformly replied that such matters have already been settled by the Pope. The countercultural church, they say, will not tack to the fickle winds of popularity. Well, there's a lot in the culture that we should be counter to if that's what we're going to talk about. We could also be countercultural to the norms of society, which identifies worth with net worth, which identifies quality with power. I mean, I doubt if there are many bishops who, when they're told that some insignificant person who hasn't got the money to given to the bishop's appeal is out, would like to see him, or maybe even more courteously called or wrote for an appointment, and then someone else comes in without telling ahead of time that, Your Excellency, so-and-so is out there. Oh, bring him in. You can be sure the person they're bringing in is a wealthy, powerful person in the community who has probably given a lot of money to the church. Now, I'm not deploring that. I'm just saying there is a natural built-in bias that has been operative in the church. And it's dangerous when a bishop becomes countercultural and stands over against that bias. Oscar Arnulfo Romero became a bishop, and he was appointed according to the usual cookie mold. He was a conservative cleric, appointed Archbishop of El Salvador, and he was transformed by his job. And he began to see reality in a different way because he could see what was happening to his own people and to his own priests. And through the transformation, he became a dangerous person because he no longer operated according to that traditional culture. When he was invited, this is true, when he was invited over to do a baptism by one of his wealthier parishioners, he said, well, I'd be happy to do the baptism. We do the baptisms at the cathedral as such and such. And the person recoiled. You mean with those people? They expected, they'd send the Mercedes over to pick him up, and he would do a special baptism in the mansion. And then, of course, he would stay on and so forth. That was the way it was done. And Oscar Romero said, no, come to the cathedral with everybody else. Well, everybody else? And when Oscar Romero was gunned down while presiding at the Eucharist, he wasn't gunned down because he held a certain view on papal infallibility or the real presence or the ordination of women. He was gunned down because he had become a dangerous person because he refused to be part of that kind of culture which equated worth with net worth and power, and which conversely equated poverty with somehow God's disfavor, in true stereotypically Calvinist fashion. The favor of God is most obvious in the prosperity that we either have or don't have. And so we return to the proverbial square one on the solutions board offered by the second group in the debate. Express regret for the sexual abuse that has occurred on the part of the few bad apples in the priesthood, seek the forgiveness of victims, and promise never to let it happen again. And if we do all that, the church will somehow reemerge stronger than before. Many priests and laypersons are convinced that such will not be the case. Much more needs to be done if the church is to transcend this terrible crisis and become an even more luminous sign and a more effective instrument of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the reign of God. However, it requires leadership to articulate such a vision of the church, to motivate and inspire people to embrace it, and to provide them with guidance and resources to bring that vision to fulfillment. Suffice it to say for now that in the teeth of this crisis, the church in the United States sorely missed strong Episcopal leaders like the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago, Cardinal John Dearden of Detroit, and Bishop James Malone of Youngstown, Ohio, all widely respected former presidents of the U.S. National Conference of Bishops. The papal biographer George Weigel had insisted at the time when the crisis was at its white-hot intensity in 2002, that one of the most urgent matters the church must face in the aftermath of this crisis, and I'm quoting him, is a re-examination of the criteria by which bishops are selected, end of quote. I'm happy here this evening to agree with George Weigel, at least on that point, even if we would surely not agree on the criteria themselves or on their application to specific appointments. But in the end, it is in fact a matter of effective pastoral leadership that can guide the church's efforts to look openly and honestly at every aspect of the crisis and to propose, or at least allow to emerge, bold solutions that need not contradict the essence of the faith itself. Without such leadership, the church will find itself caught in the grip of this terrible crisis for many years to come. Leadership, however, cannot succeed without some measure of trust. Not only the laity's trust of the hierarchy, but the hierarchy's trust of the laity. As Margaret Steinfeld said so well in her address to the bishops in Dallas 3 years ago, and I quote her, "Much has been said and written about the laity's growing distrust of bishops. Let me take note of something else, the hierarchy's distrust of the laity. Indeed, the bishops," end of quote, "indeed the bishops do not seem still to trust the laity to handle an open and public discussion of this crisis, under whatever relevant aspect, including, for example, issues like the sexual maturity or lack thereof of seminarians, priests, and bishops, the continued viability of obligatory celibacy for priests of the Roman or Latin Rite, the financial and decision-making accountability of pastors and bishops towards their people, the process by which pastors and bishops are selected and assigned to parishes and dioceses, and the role of women in the church and the reasons for their widespread alienation from the church's official leadership and from the policies and regulations which those leaders formulate, promote, and seek to enforce. Nothing underscores this point, the hierarchy's distrust of the laity, more effectively than the thoroughly counterproductive decisions of some bishops to prohibit the new lay organization, Voice of the Faithful, from holding meetings on parish property that they paid for in the first place. This organization was founded, as many of you know, in early 2002 as an entirely constructive gesture by a distinguished, if I may say, Tom, Notre Dame alumnus, Dr. James Muller, a cardiologist here at Mass General Hospital, also parishioner at St. John's in Wellesley, who was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 as part of a group of physicians against nuclear war. Repression and censorship are surely not the way to restore our trust in our ecclesiastical leaders, nor for them to restore their trust in the laity, who make up about 99% of the church's membership. In her same talk to the bishops 3 years ago, Peggy Steinfeld used an apt line from Cardinal John Henry Newman, who, when asked about the role of the laity in the church, replied, and I quote, "The church would look foolish without them." And I would add, and the hierarchy would be out of a job without them. This crisis did not just, so where do we go from here? This crisis did not just begin in January of 2002, nor was it ever confined to Boston. It was and is national and international in scope. In the mid-1980s, there were documented cases of similar clerical misconduct involving children and young people, most notably with the conviction of a Louisiana priest in 1985. The New Orleans journalist Jason Berry brought the matter to the attention of a wider public in 1992 with his book entitled "Lead Us Not into Temptation," subtitled "Catholic Priests and the Sexual Abuse of Children." In that same year, the U.S. Catholic bishops voted for a series of norms that all the bishops were encouraged to follow, although on a purely voluntary basis. The bishops recommended that dioceses respond to charges of sexual abuse promptly and in full cooperation with civil authorities, that those credibly charged with perpetrating abuse be suspended from active ministry and referred for treatment, that victims and their families be dealt with compassionately, and that the issue of sexual abuse by priests be addressed openly without any veil of secrecy. Many bishops complied with these recommendations in their own dioceses, but others did not. If we are to restore confidence and trust in our bishops and also in our priests, there must be a broader and more meaningful lay involvement in the process by which bishops and pastors are selected, and also in the governance of dioceses and parishes. But we must also address the problem of clerical culture, to which many commentators, including Eugene Kennedy, your first lecturer in this year's series, and Father Donald Cousins have referred. Although there have been some significant improvements in seminary education over the past few years, the situation still obtains where seminarians are educated and spiritually formed in close residence together for a period of 4 to 6 years. During one of the most psychologically formative periods of their lives, it is at the least very difficult to develop into a sexually integrated human being under circumstances of that sort. And a psychological study conducted under the sponsorship of the bishops in the early 1970s, a study headed by Eugene Kennedy, by the way, found this to be the case with many priests of that time. A major significant finding, his quote, not mine, of that research was, quote, that a large proportion of priests emerge as underdeveloped persons, and that chief among the signs of this underdevelopment is the failure to achieve, quote, an integrated psychosexual identity. For whatever reasons, the study continued, these priests have not resolved the problems which are ordinarily worked through during the time of adolescence. Father Donald Cousins, currently at John Carroll University in Cleveland, writes and speaks with the authority of even greater and more recent experience. As vicar for clergy and religious in the Diocese of Cleveland for 6 years, and then as rector and president of Cleveland's major seminary for another 6 years. In his recent Commonweal article, I cannot recommend it strongly enough. It's only 2 pages. It is excellent. I take credit. I was the one who prodded him into writing it. But it's an excellent article. It's called Sex in the Seminaries. He writes, and I quote, "Seminaries are addressing, more or less successfully, the theoretical issues related to sexuality and celibacy. Much more than our time at St. John's or comparable seminaries back in the 50s and early 60s. But then Father Cousins goes on in his article, the personal existential issues remain unaddressed. And this next sentence is so important, I'm going to repeat it after I finish. The controlling conceit fostered in the seminary community is that as an institution, it is asexual. The controlling conceit fostered in the seminary community is that as an institution, it is asexual. Father Cousins continues, and I'm quoting him, many, perhaps most seminarians who believe they are being called to priesthood do not have a charism for celibacy. That is, a graced aptitude for consecrated single life. Charisms, I'm still quoting Father Cousins, charisms by definition cannot be legislated unless one believes that God, following the long-standing practice of the Church, will grant the charism to each and every candidate for the priesthood. Well, it's obviously not true. Thousands of priests have left the priesthood, not because they're sexually perverse, but because they fell in love. So obviously they didn't have the charism for lifelong celibacy. So it's not a question of a theoretical point. It's a question of an empirically verifiable fact. When Father Cousins says, on the basis of long-time experience as a seminary president, rector, faculty member, vicar for clergy and religious in a large diocese, that many, perhaps most seminarians who believe that they are being called to the priesthood do not have a charism for celibacy. More and more lay people, and not a few priests, I can tell you, are beginning to ask, or have been asking for a long time, if the Church really believes that God calls only those to the priesthood who are not called to the sacrament of marriage, and who are also not female. Father Cousins points out that seminary rectors and faculty know that the celibacy requirement has dramatically shrunk the pool of candidates for the priesthood. Furthermore, and I'm quoting him, training individuals for a charism they do not possess lends an air of hypocrisy and unreality to the entire enterprise. While it is certainly true that obligatory celibacy and the prohibition of women's ordination are not the causes of the current sexual abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic priesthood, they are surely major factors that cannot be ignored. However, I shall leave it to well-informed and ministerially active Catholic women to indicate how the presence of women in the priesthood and in other positions of pastoral authority in the church might have changed the complexion of this crisis and indeed might have averted it almost entirely. In my opinion, however, there would not have been a crisis of such magnitude were it not for the failures of pastoral leadership. In fact, survey after survey taken in this country has disclosed, among Catholics, has disclosed that by a large majority, U.S. Catholics are far more angry with their bishops than they are with the predatory priests, not in any way to excuse their behavior. Too many bishops and religious superiors followed the advice of lawyers, which is not to put lawyers down. Thank God we have lawyers in society to protect our rights. But they failed, but church lawyers are a different breed. If you're here tonight, I mean no personal offense, but church lawyers are a different breed. And they were too, rather than the instincts of their pastoral hearts, and they failed to reach out to those who claimed to have been abused by priests, because the lawyers were telling them, anything you say can be used against us, and they can wipe out the coffers, empty the coffers of the church. They were too conscious of the priesthood shortage and did everything they could to minimize the drainage from the clerical ranks by downplaying complaints, by overestimating the optimistic reports of treatment centers to which they sent sexually abusive priests, and by reassigning known predatory priests. Not that these are evil people, they got problems, but reassigning them, knowing the problems they did have, from place to place, without warning their new parishes or even their new pastors. And discovery shows, not just in Boston, but it certainly showed in Boston in the most dramatic way, that that's exactly what they did. That's exactly what they did. In the end, these bishops put the welfare and the reputation of the institutional church and the priesthood ahead of the safety of innocent children and young people. If we are to begin to restore confidence and trust in the hierarchical leadership of the church, and to begin the healing process in the church itself, there must be changes in the way bishops are selected, so that the laity, clergy, and religious of a diocese have some meaningful input into the process. And I've said this so often, I know I'm going a little bit over time. I'm almost finished. There are not a lot of pages left, just 3. But I've said this so often, and it always gets a laugh. Maybe you'll laugh. I don't do it for that purpose. But the laugh is usually one of recognition. I said, how often has it happened in your diocese or in dioceses where you're from? That announcement is made. Of course, most lay people don't really care one way or the other. They don't have to work under these bishops. But people who care are involved in the life of the church of a diocese. How often say, did you hear the news? We have a new bishop. And in my experience, you have two of the most common reactions. Who's he? Where's he from? Or, oh my God, not him. But the first is as bad as the second. In other words, I don't know who he is. You know, you elect someone in politics into a major office, President of the United States. You may have voted for the other candidate, but you had your opportunity to organize and to get your friends out to vote. And the majority wins. And you live with him. You also know there's term limits. You say you have to work harder the next time. But imagine if our presidents were chosen in the same way. Just dropped, parachuted in from God knows where. There, welcome your new bishop. Is it any wonder that they don't have a base of support? Now, some can overcome that, and marvelously so. But they just, okay, oh my God, not him, or who is he? Where did he come from? This would not be an unprecedented innovation. It would be a return to the practice of much of the first millennium in the history of the church, when pastors and bishops, even the Bishop of Rome himself, were elected by the people whom they would serve. And there were no bishops transferred from one diocese to another in that first millennium. And one of those who accepted, by the way, election as Bishop of Rome, the famous Pope Formosus, the one who was dug up and put on trial from his grave, was the so-called cadaver synod. It's one of my favorite stories in my Get the Lives of the Popes, read all about it. You know what one of the charges against him was? That he accepted election as Bishop of Rome when he already held a diocese. He was Bishop of Porto. That was explicitly forbidden by the Council of Nicaea in 325, which was, engaged in other important matters like defining the divinity of Christ. And the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which was also engaged in rather important matters, that is, defining the relationship between the human nature and the divine nature in the one divine person of Jesus Christ. Those councils nonetheless had disciplinary canons which absolutely forbade a priest or a bishop from transferring from one diocese to another. Talk again about the marital imagery. We love to use that to defend things we want to defend. Like, well, women can't be priests because after all, the priest is the image of Christ and he is the bridegroom. I always tell my students, I don't mind sharing it with you, well, under that same theology, men cannot be members of the church because the church is the bride of Christ and men cannot be brides. So much for the nonsense. That's when you get desperate. When one excuse doesn't work, try another. Now, I have one political comment. When your first reason for going into Iraq doesn't work, then keep trying others. But it's the same thing. What happens is, you don't say, whoops, I made a mistake. No, really the reason was regime change or something. No, it was first to get weapons of mass destruction. And the same thing is true. Why can't women be ordained? Well, tradition. Well, that argument is the weakest. Because we can always go back and say, well, this started the first time. We never did it before, but now we are. So that ends that argument for that particular practice. So the most recent one is that the priest must be an iconic representation of Christ, who is a bridegroom. It's pathetic, really. I mean, just say you're against women priests, period. Because you think women are second-rate human beings or whatever, that they are not worthy to stand before God as a man. Because after all, the male priest alone can talk to God man to man. So, but you see how profound, how deep these theological reasons go. There's a theology of God involved in this. I love to do that with people when they say, well, we can't ordain women because Jesus said we can't. Well, because he didn't. There's no evidence that he did. But you say, well, let's take your hypothesis as true, that Jesus did lay down some rule. It's hidden away in the Da Vinci Code. That women cannot be ordained. Now, just speculate with me, will you? I'm kind of bored tonight and so forth. Why would you think Jesus would have made that rule? You'll stump them. What possible reason could he have had? Except that, women are second-rate. You can't trust them. The really important stuff only a man can handle. That's nonsense. But the Second Vatican Council, and I am coming to the end, the Second Vatican Council reminded us that the church is the whole people of God. The laity are not simply the hierarchy, spiritual clientele. The bishops and the clergy are themselves an integral part of the people of God. They're individual baptized Christians set apart, which is the root meaning of the word clergy, for the service of all. But all of us share by reason of baptism in the mission and ministries of the church, to proclaim, to celebrate, to embody, and to facilitate the coming reign of God, which, as we know, is a reign of justice and peace, as well as of holiness and grace, as Vatican II put it. Confidence and trust can also be restored, and healing can begin, at least partially, if the structures that already exist in the church were to function properly, that is, freely and independently. These structures include parish councils, diocesan pastoral councils, presbyteral councils, diocesan synods, world synods of bishops, and the like. However, the tendency still exists on the part of the Vatican and many bishops to control rather than to enable the laity in their God-given work on behalf of the Church and the reign of God. Witness, for example, the ongoing efforts on the part of the Vatican to limit the scope of lay involvement in the liturgy, lest the distinctive identity and spiritual powers of the priest be somehow diminished thereby. Don't ever let the laity receive communion before you do. I mean, isn't that the way you operate when you invite someone to your home? You eat first, and then you share with the rest? And that is why so many of the best people in a parish, notice I didn't say the best people, I said so many of the best people in a parish or diocese have not invested their time, their talent, and their energy in such bodies. They have seen for themselves that these structures too often have no real authority and at worst function simply as rubber stamps for the bishop or pastor. Trust and confidence can only be restored to the extent that accountability is restored, that is, by changing the way the church makes decisions affecting its parishes, dioceses, and the universal church itself. We already see evidence that if the laity use the power they have, they can change those decisions, as we've seen some parishes that were closed were reopened. I'm not saying we all have to sleep in there for 6 months, but again, it's an illustration. You know, you apply enough counter pressure, they'll back off. Not always, but they'll back off. By changing the way in which candidates for the priesthood are recruited, and every one of these terms is important: recruited, screened, theologically educated, spiritually formed. And by changing the way bishops themselves are selected and then appointed for the service of a particular diocese and or promoted from one diocese to another. Structural, systemic changes of this sort are not made easily nor in the short term. They require a long and arduous process and a lot of staying power and determination on the part of dedicated lay people as well as clergy and religious. But the stakes are as high as they can be because the health of the church's sacramental life is at risk. That's what it means to be in crisis. We have a great opportunity, but it is marked with danger or risk. On human terms alone, one sees that true structural and spiritual renewal and reform constitute a nearly impossible hope. But with confidence and trust in the power of the Holy Spirit, it can in fact be accomplished. Our President Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame, Father Theodore Hesburgh, who is, in my judgment, himself a model, a supermodel, if you will, of leadership. He has a short prayer that he recites in Latin every day of his life. It should be our prayer as well. Veni Sancte Spiritus. Come, Holy Spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you so much. And Dick has agreed to take some comments, questions, observations from you. And just for the sake of holy order, I will try to facilitate that. Personal anecdote in response to the question of bridegroom and so on. When I first married Colleen, I told her that if we ever had a daughter, I wanted to call her Bridie. She protested. Yeah, Bridie groom. It wouldn't have worked, I don't think. The first comment and the first observation. I think I see a hand over here.
I saw you on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, yes.
You did give me hope, and that's why we're here.
Thank you.
You alluded earlier to the parish closings in the Boston Archdiocese and the Sexuality scandal. I'm not a statistician, but there seems to be an extremely high correlation between the pastors who signed the letter asking for the cardinal's resignation the parishes that have been closed. What would you say to the priests who are in those parishes, and what hope can you give us for dissent in the church in the new conservative realm?
Well, thank you for your nice comment. Tom and those who know me know that I don't dodge questions, but I don't pretend to have answers to questions if I don't. I don't know. There are priests from Boston here, and maybe I don't want to call on them, but you might talk to them. I don't know if there is a correlation. My suspicion is that there isn't, because even though, as you know, I'm not reluctant to be critical of people in the hierarchy, I still am probably innocent enough to attribute to them a certain minimal common sense and political prudence. It would really be very, very dangerous for them to make it obvious that they are going down a list and punishing priests who signed a particular petition. Oh, by the way, I predicted, I'll share with you some of the predictions I've made that I was wrong on, but one of the predictions I remember, I kept getting asked by the Boston press, Boston Globe in particular, all through 2002 and into 2003, do you think Cardinal Law will survive all this stuff? And I said, Cardinal Law, as any bishop, will remain in office no matter what comes out, unless and until he begins to lose the support of his priests. No bishop can function who does not have the support of his priests. And when those priests came out, and I remember the late Bob Bullock, great priest, when he was head of the group at the time, and he said they felt the need to get the statement out as quickly as possible. Had they waited, and he felt that it would be a mistake to wait, they could have gotten 2, 3, 4 times as many signatures. But they felt it was important to get the statement out, coming so soon after the latest disclosures. And as it turned out, I personally believe that was the decisive factor. And, there's groups around the country, I get their emails, they want, one of Cardinal Law's former auxiliary bishops who's up the road, removed and all that. There's no way any of that, and I hold no brief one way or the other, but there's no way any bishop is going to be removed unless he loses the support of a significant number of his priests. So whatever the reason, if you've got a presbyterate in a diocese that, unlike the presbyterate of Boston, did not have the leadership and the courage of their convictions, and also the concern for their young people who are victimized, nothing really is going to happen, because the measure of bureaucratic inertia trumps any concerns that are expressed by individuals or groups. I hate to say it, I'm not a clericalist in saying this, but the clergy are the most important single group in a diocese when it comes to that particular issue. So I haven't made the correlation. I don't know if it's true. I'd be suspicious. I'd be skeptical that it was true, because it would be just too blatantly stupid. But anyway, that's as much as I can say.
I've heard some people argue that our Protestant brothers and sisters who have gone the route, are more liberal Protestant sects, who have gone the route of women priests that are electing their own bishops, and of course the controversy in New Hampshire with the homosexual ordained bishop, and that their numbers are falling even more drastically than our Catholic numbers, and that in fact that argues for us to become more of what we used to be, or more hold on to those basic beliefs.
Well, that's an interesting point. Well, first of all, we cannot be what we used to be. It's gone. What we used to be is gone. Okay? We can't go back. Which is not to say it was all bad back there. I'm a product of that church. There's a lot of good about that. We can't go back. We're talking today, I was talking at the Institute, we had a light supper before we came over. I was saying, just the changes that have occurred in the world, not just in America, since 1980 when I went to Notre Dame. The Catholicism book, you don't have that one here, do you? Yeah. I composed this 3 days a week I left my post at the Institute, thanks to my staff who were just excellent to take up the slack. I used to go out to Weston to Pope John Seminary, my former stomping grounds, and I composed this book, Catholicism, on a manual typewriter. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack, and I did it. Today we have computers, word processors. I carry a BlackBerry. I get email. You say, weren't that the good old days when we clackety-clacked and we had carbon paper and we had whiteouts, and gee, the Selectric typewriter, put those things in. Wouldn't it be great to go back? You got to be nuts. I mean, you can think back and be nostalgic about it, say, gee, those were interesting days, simpler times. But you've got to move forward. You've got to live in the world as it is, not in the world as you remember it when you were a kid. And it's not going to go back to the way it was. Bing Crosby, he is deceased. We hope he's in heaven. But the priest he played is also long gone. And Barry Fitzgerald is long gone. Going My Way has gone away. That church is gone. That doesn't mean it was all bad, no. But we're living now in the 21st century. We're not going to go back to that. And again, I can only appeal to my contemporaries, some of whom are here. And it's not to disparage a whole group. There are some fine young men who are in the priesthood and coming into seminaries. I'm not suggesting otherwise. On the contrary, I teach some of them at Notre Dame. But it is a common observation of middle-aged to older priests, especially those who are pastors, about the clericalism and the rigidity and the inability to be relaxed and to relate to lay people, especially women. And also, these young men sit in judgment of the pastor. I noticed you didn't you put the pall over. I mean, God, we used to argue about, the liberal was, he doesn't use the pall, doesn't use the maniple. You don't even know what a maniple is. That's what liberals did in those days. They didn't use the maniple. And the real liberals, of course, wore linen surplices, not the lace kind. So that's the triviality that things were fought over in those days. But you always have those tensions. So we're not going to go back. And by the way, I'd like to see the statistics that say that the clergy in other churches are having more of a vocations crisis than we, but they're not. Doesn't mean there's no problems. And lawyers would tell you bad cases make bad law. The Gene Robinson ordination in New Hampshire is a hard case. Hard cases make bad law. And that's not a typical. At least the Episcopalians, and I'm not holding them up now as being all pure and without problems. They got their problems. But at least the Episcopalians, when they get a bishop, and if he doesn't turn out for, or she, the Archbishop of Indianapolis is a woman. There's other women who are bishops. If they don't turn out well, you have no one to blame but themselves. They didn't ask, who's he or who's she? Where did they come from? Oh my God, not him. They have a process. The lay people have a role. The clergy have a role. And then it goes to the House of Bishops. And they have to approve. In fact, in the Robinson case, it was a close 60-40. They approved, but it was a lot of bishops who were concerned the impact on the life, on the unity of the church. But let me go back to the fundamental point. I don't want to. It's like what's going on now in the Congress. The New York Times has an editorial this morning about this. We shouldn't be talking about the process by which, whether we have a majority vote or 60 senators can block or you're needed to unblock a judicial nomination. The real issue is, what are the qualifications of these judges that have been put up? That's the issue. And the issue here is not, and I'm not trivializing your question, it's a very good question. The issue is not, whether the Lutherans are doing better or worse than we are. The issue is, regardless of numbers, and I don't concede the point on numbers, why do we insist that priests of the Latin Rite, the Roman Catholic Church, must be celibate? Why do we insist that you have to have the charism of lifelong celibacy to be a priest? When it's demonstrably the case, A, that we don't have enough priests anymore to fulfill the basic sacramental responsibilities of the church in many parts of the world, even in this country. And there was a B somewhere, but it's getting late. So we don't have the priests, or the B is, and it's demonstrably the case that we've lost thousands of priests because they came into the priesthood and were ordained and accepted by the church when in fact, not in theory, they did not have the charism of celibacy. They didn't have it. The evidence is they left to marry. They didn't have it. So if they have it, fine. Welcome it. It's a gift of God. It's charism. It's a gift. But the church is tying its hands behind its back and is asking for trouble, and now it sees the kind of trouble it's got. It's asking for trouble when it limits the pool of candidates that narrowly.
I see a hand here and the next one, too. Yes.
What did you call? Okay.
I am a member of Voice of the Faithful, and we weren't able to meet.
Little loudly if you could.
I am a member of Voice of the Faithful, and we weren't able to meet in our parish for quite a while, but luckily, we have a new pastor who has welcomed us, and he, I think, is one of the ones that keeps on that list, so we're very glad of that. You mentioned that you said the problem goes much deeper than the church's moral teaching. If I'm misquoting, tell me. We're dealing with evil itself.
Oh no, that's just part of the sentence. I mean, the mystery of evil is involved too. I mean, I don't want to pretend here that all acts of against the commandments and the laws of the church are the results of psychological disturbances. Okay, I'm not saying that, so that's why I threw in. That's to cover myself, you see. That's what you get after many years, because people insist on saying, well, you notice he didn't mention love, so he's against love, or something like that. Well, I said it. I mean, obviously the mystery of evil is involved as well, but I think that's a last resort. You don't automatically jump to that conclusion. The devil made me do it, Flip Wilson's line. You have to really date yourself when you say Flip Wilson. You didn't even show any recognition of Flip Wilson. But anyway, the devil made me do it. Well, I don't want to have an argument here about the devil. But what you always look for first is a reasonable explanation. You don't automatically go to the miracle, you see. Something happens, you don't say, well, miracle. First of all, you try to find an explanation that comes out of what is empirically verifiable. And I think in almost every case, and I'm just covering myself by saying almost, I don't want to say none, but in almost every case, it's not a question of evil so much as sickness. It was my classmate, and one of my other classmates is here, it was my classmate who was murdered in prison, John Gagan. He was not an evil person. He was a victim of the Archdiocese of Boston. He should not have been allowed to continue in the ministry. He should have been given serious treatment. And if the medical profession is correct, he should never have been allowed to be in the company of young people. He should have been institutionalized, maybe the rest of his life, I don't know. But not an institution like a prison, where he was brutally murdered. So I go back to my point. What we need is excellent pastoral leadership. I mean, you can tell when you ask a person a question, you can tell if they've gone on automatic pilot. They're giving you the party line. They're not able to speak honestly back to you. And the worst question you can throw at a bishop is to ask him about sexuality, his own. I don't mean reveal any associations. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about I'm just talking about, how do you feel about celibacy? Oh, it's a jewel of the church. I mean, you know that's not real. Oh, it's, have you ever had a problem? Oh, no, God has given the grace and all that. I mean, I'm very close to using an expletive. I won't. You know when you're talking to somebody who's really thought things out, who's giving you an honest answer. Those are the kinds of people we want in leadership. Not the people who give you the party line, the rote answers, because you know they've never grappled or they've never allowed themselves to admit that they have any problems. And until we have more people in pastoral leadership who are really authentic human beings, I don't care if they're liberal or conservative, I want them healthy. I'll take a healthy conservative any day of the week over an unhealthy liberal. I want a healthy human being who has a sense of his own or her own limitations, who has a sense of humor, who doesn't get obsessed with any criticism or challenge, who's not defensive. Say, hey, look, you may have a better answer. I'm just working on it like you. I need all the help I can get. Let's talk about it. That person you can identify. You don't need someone who knows all the answers. You need someone who is willing to work with you in trying to find answers and doesn't think he has them already. The tradition of the church, we have a lot of answers, and we want to use those answers. But they haven't been forced down anyone's throats. The answers I don't want to keep frozen are the ones that have been forced down people's throats, when everybody knows they're not true. So anyway, that's my point. Mystery of evil, the mystery of evil is a factor. I would never deny that. But the only thing I caution against is using that trump card too soon in the game.
The tempest always fuges, I find. But I think we'll take the last question from Betty Ann, and then I just want to make a closing comment.
That's what I'm afraid of, is this closing comment.
We've heard so much in the press the last couple of weeks about relativism versus the absolute truth, and decrying relativism in the church. And I wanted you to comment a bit on our new Pope's Ecclesiology and his view of where the truth comes from. It seems with Veritatis Splendor and the reigning ecclesiology is that the Holy Spirit is speaking to one man in Rome, and a few of the curia, and the rest of us are listening. Could you comment a little bit about his ecclesiology? People say he's open to listen, where that truth comes from.
Well, that's a very large question. This is what and Tom doesn't want me to spend the next 20 minutes on this question because people have to get home and do other things. Let me just say this much. Let me just kind of repeat what I said when I heard the news, and when the cardinal from Chile came out and said, Cardinal, Joseph from Cardinal. I turned to the producer, I said, it's Ratzinger, because there was no other candidate, Joseph. And so we had some time until he came out and so forth, and but he chose the name Benedict, and so the first thing I said, and by the way, we were already talking about Benedict on ABC because Charles Gibson, who was the anchor, said to me, well, Father McBride, you know that we just heard, and Tom will love this, that there's an Irish betting association that is giving 3-to-1 odds that the new Pope is going to choose the name Benedict. And I said on the air afterwards, I said, well, those Irish bettors know more than theologians, I can tell you. But that's true. And so it gave me the chance, and I said, I hadn't thought about Benedict. Because I said the important thing is, a key thing, the first important policy statement a new pope makes is when he chooses a name. And I went through, obviously, it was John the 24th, that says something. If it's John Paul the third, that says something. If it's Paul the 7th will say something. Very positive, I explained. Or Pius the 13th, I said, that'll be an in-your-face candidate. Because he said, in spite of all the things that are said about Pius XII, the Holocaust and all that. So he comes out, and so I said good things about Benedict. I said, hey, that's a good idea. I said, he's one of my favorite popes. Benedict XV was a great pope. He was an underrated pope. And the thing about Benedict XV is he came into office. He'd only been a cardinal 3 months. He came into office right at the height of the most divisive, the most highly charged atmosphere of any modern pontificate, and that was the pontificate of Pius X. They had the anti-modernist craze, they had anti-modernist oaths, and then they had a papal spy system. It was called the Sodalitium Pianum, named after Pius V. And they literally, they encouraged people to report their professors and anyone they heard. And the word delate was a word used in that, I'm delated to Rome. My uncle was a priest in the Archdiocese of Hartford, and he used to tell me in the seminary where he studied up in Rochester, St. Bernard's, he said that his professors would want to see the notes. They would say, no, don't misunderstand me, because it was an atmosphere where people were constantly getting reported to Rome. The only thing is they didn't have email and phones, cell phones, so it took a while to get over there. But those guys didn't have much to do in those days anyway, so I guess but anyway, people were fired from their jobs, some were excommunicated. It was a terrible atmosphere. And Benedict XV came into office, and within 2 months he issued an encyclical, Ad Beatissimi, Apostolorum. I don't think that was the Latin title now. I'm really getting tired. At the threshold, Ad Limina Apostolorum, at the threshold of the apostles. And basically what he said in that encyclical, among other things, is cut it out. He said this warfare between Catholics has got to stop, and we have to stop using epithets to describe ourselves. In those days, the epithet was, today we talk about Orthodox, it was integral Catholics. That group of Catholics were called integralists. And he said, the word Catholic doesn't need an epithet. We're all Catholics. And Benedict XV, as Cardinal Ratzinger, now Benedict XVI, said, was a peacemaker. But actually, he failed in his efforts of peacemaking among nations. Both sides thought he was on the other side. And so when he offered his help in the armistice and the peace terms of the First World War, they just excluded him. But he was an effective peacemaker inside the church. So, number one, I took courage from the fact that he chose the name Benedict. Well, it remains to be seen how he intends. And now I realize St. Benedict of Nursia is also there, but Benedict of Nursia was great. He said the abbot should be elected by all, and that the abbot should especially listen to his monks, starting with the junior most. So there's a lot of wonderful things in the Benedictine rule. We'll hold them to it. And the other thing that I've been impressed with, and please, I'm not trying to be, put a nice rosy gloss on the thing, because, you could come back in 3, 4, 5 weeks, tell Tom to send me an email, say, what did you do? You thought this and thought that, and it's not proved to be the case. But the hardline homily that he gave at the Mass for electing a pope before they went in, I really thought he was acknowledging that he wasn't going to be elected, and he was just, in a sense, kind of give strength to his base, so as they would be sure not, to elect either one of their own or somebody who would not be in the other camp. But as it turned out, he got elected. But I contrast that talk with all the talks he's given since he's been out. And I've said this in writing, and I'll say it to you now as my final comment. I said this on national television. I said, what we've got to do is give him a chance to establish himself. He's now the Bishop of Rome. He's now the Pope. He's no longer Cardinal Ratzinger. He's no longer the chief enforcer of orthodoxy. He's no longer the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So the question really before the house, before the church is, will Pope Ratzinger and Cardinal Ratzinger be one and the same? Or will Pope Ratzinger, as another great Jesuit, Father Cardinal Avery Dulles said the other day in an interview I was involved with as well, that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is the father of all, and he must be a unifier of all. That's what Pope Benedict XV was. And my hope and prayer is that Benedict XVI will follow in the footsteps of Benedict XV. He may or may not. But I ended my talk, Veni Creator Spiritus, Veni Sancte Spiritus, come Holy Spirit. We have to be people of hope, and that we cannot judge the history of the church by one thin slice of it. Thank you.